Can I ask the witnesses on the first panel to introduce themselves, please?
Good morning, I'm Kevin Dunleavy. I'm Head of Leasehold Services for the Guinness Partnership, which is a 70,000 home housing association providing services to 160,000 residents across England. I have over 2 decades of leasehold management experience in the sector, and I'm actively involved in a number of working groups looking at matters around leasehold reform and Commonhold.
I'm David O'Leary. I'm Executive Director at the Home Builders Federation, the principal trade body for UK developers, and I am a former member of the Commonhold Council.
Are developers and housing associations supportive in principle of the move to Commonhold as the default tenure? Kevin, can I start with you?
So we absolutely understand the need for Commonhold, and we understand the frustrations that many leaseholders feel under some of the outcomes that are generated through the leasehold system. So we're absolutely committed to working with officials and other stakeholder groups to make Commonhold a success. If it is going to happen, we need it to work. It needs not just to work for the registered providers, but it also needs to work for our future and current residents, especially our shared owners as well.
Yes, we are supportive in principle. There are some questions and concerns that we have about the transition and about the detail of the forthcoming Commonhold legislation. But in general, we support the principle and want to work with the government on it.
Just on that point about transition, what would you be looking for from government in terms of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of years and months. But I think what we really need is to ensure that the whole kind of ecosystem around the housing industry and around the conveyance of new homes and existing homes is ready for it. We've, as an industry, been on we've borne the brunt of some legislation that's been introduced over the last few years that where public bodies and others haven't been ready and it's been left to developers. Things like the introduction of the building safety regulator and biodiversity net gain. And we don't want to be in that position moving forward, because ultimately it'll be new build home buyers who then bear the brunt.
Did you have any comments on transition and what you'd like to see?
So the main areas of concern that we've got that we're keen to explore is around how we can ensure Commonhold associations are sufficiently supported for safe management of buildings, but also about the practical support for registered providers and providing affordable housing tenures in those developments. Well, obviously the bill has focused on shared ownership, but the majority of the affordable units we're going to be delivering, especially with the forthcoming grant funding period, are probably going to be for rent. So we need to think about how that's going to work practically as well.
Do you think there will be any negative impacts on the new leasehold flat ban on housing supply and new developments? And if so, how can the government mitigate against that?
It's hard to say at the moment, and I think the uncertainty is the biggest concern. We're applying for funding now as part of the 26 to 36 funding programme. And that means we're looking to make decisions now that may not deliver new homes for another 10 years or even beyond that. And any disruption to the housing economy during that period of time has got the potential to cause some degree of disruption. So really what we're keen to do is to be able to work with the appropriate officials to explore what could be the possible disruptions so we can start identifying solutions. But fundamentally, we need that clarity as quickly as possible so that we can start making those commercial decisions so it minimises the future impact.
David, same question?
I think if the transition is a sensible one and one that kind of gives everyone in the ecosystem enough time to deal with it, then it needn't disrupt housing supply. But in a sense, it's a question more for some of your panellists later on. It's a question for the mortgage lenders and for conveyancers and everyone else involved to know when they will be ready. And from a new build perspective, what we're keen to ensure is that this Commonhold doesn't just become a new build tenure. It's a kind of a wholesale tenure that works across the piece. So we would like to see a flow of conversions as well as just new build Commonhold associations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Prior to coming to this place, I've spent 15 years working in housing associations, including in sort of property management of schemes like this, blocks of flats, etc., with management companies. And RPs are normally pretty already heavily involved in their governance arrangements. Can you set out why Commonhold it or whether Commonhold should be more resource intensive than it currently already is with leasehold.
Well, once again, this is what we need to understand. So there's a degree of speculation here until we see more information. But as a principle, we could be developing new blocks of flats ourselves that from the outset, we're not going to be in control of the management. It's going to be through the Commonhold Association. But we're still going to be housing our affordable housing tenures within that building. And if we look at the current standards that have come into force from the regulator of social housing, they do not differentiate between our affordable housing residents that live in buildings we do control and those that live in buildings we do not control. So we're still accountable. We've still got to report on the degree of safety and so on that applies to those residents. That's going to therefore potentially add an additional layer of complexity to how we have to engage with the Commonhold Association, and we're not sure yet what that's going to look like. So, for example, are we going to be expected to fully engage, perhaps become corporate directors of those Commonhold associations? How would private flat owners feel about that? Some might think that's a good thing, some may not. But even if we are, increasingly, if we were taking on that responsibility, we'd almost have to look at those Commonhold associations as subsidiaries of our own organisations, because our board of directors would then become responsible for ensuring those Commonhold associations are discharging their duties and are fully compliant. So that's where it could potentially create governance risk, and it could give rise to additional resource requirements depending on what we need to do.
In terms of resource intensity, I think the main concern that we have is to what extent consumers, customers, the buyers of new build homes will consider these to be desirable. I think there is an assumption that Commonhold will be more desirable than leasehold, and I'm sure that if the transition works well and if the legislation is better than the 2002 Act, then I'm sure it will be. But we don't quite know that yet, and whether when we're trying to, as developers, sell homes to new build home buyers, will they want to take on necessarily the responsibilities and the duties that come with the Commonhold Association?
On that, Mr. O'Leary, though, other countries have phased out leaseholds. US, EU, Canada, New Zealand, you pick one. There's no sense that they're the people are not getting on the housing market. In some ways, you might even argue that their housing markets are in a better condition. What do you have to say to that?
Well, perhaps, I mean, what I would say to that is that they won't necessarily have the sort of duality of leasehold and Commonhold, where as a, say, first-time buyer, you'll have the opportunity for some time to go and purchase a leasehold property instead of a Commonhold, if that is more desirable. And I'm not saying it necessarily will be. I would like to hope that this is we achieve this in the right way, and it isn't more desirable, but that is a risk at the moment.
And Mr. Dunleavy, I mean, you'll have seen about how the votes are distributed according to the bill. I mean, do you think that draws the right balance?
Well, we've looking at Section 18, we can see that the provisions are in there, and it looks like, so it obviously takes account of the 10-year qualifying repair period in the new model lease. We understand the reasons for that. I think what we really would be keen to do, however, is to work with stakeholder groups, including those that represent shared owners, because the model has to be viable not just for the registered provider but also for shared owners, or it just falls down. So I don't think it's appropriate necessarily for just one party to that contract say, yeah, that works fine for us. We do need to give thought to what the impact's going to be on shared owners as well. Well, obviously, we're going to have an interest in the asset. We're going to be held accountable by the regulator, so it's important that we've got that stake in there and that we can exercise some form of meaningful control.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Two relatively short questions. Are developers and housing associations concerned about the loss of secondary income streams which leaseholds can provide?
No, the current system of leasehold that is operating, I mean, I've heard it described as Commonhold light, so there isn't a kind of economic value in the freeholds. So no, I don't think that's a consideration at all.
The Guinness partnership is not concerned at all.
That's reassuring. And then a question for David, if I may. Developers are not building like you should. I know I've got about 2,000 properties in my constituency of Woking that are not being developed despite having had planning permission for years. Almost all of them are leasehold flats. Are leasehold flats as attractive to be built as they once were? And is leasehold reform creating uncertainty that's stopping development?
I don't think leasehold reform and the transition is the thing that's stopping development, no. I mean, but what we do see is a massive challenge in building apartment schemes. We've seen an influx of additional policy costs, additional taxes on new homes in general, but they disproportionately hit the development of new build apartments. So later this year we've got the building safety levy coming into force. When you factor in the additional circulation space that comes with an apartment scheme, the cost of building those is huge and disproportionate. And so, yeah, generally developers are, in many cases, building fewer apartment schemes today than they were a decade or two ago, definitely.
Thank you. Chris.
I just flip Will's question around. I mean, it's only anecdotal, but when I speak to people, they're often nervous about taking on those apartments, which I assume is reducing demand, because of the problems that currently exist in the leasehold system. Do you not have some confidence that perhaps if the government does fix this, it could help increase demand for those kind of properties and help move the market along?
Yeah, it possibly could do. I mean, we've not seen any example of the tenure of those types of schemes being a problematic factor. But whether a move to Commonhold will help to increase demand for new build apartments, I don't know. I mean, the problem then, or the question then, is how the mortgage lending industry treat Commonhold. And I know there are some lenders at the moment who support Commonhold. I'm not sure whether that would be for new Commonhold schemes. And when we talk about the lending industry, it's important to understand that new build lending is a very small subset of the entire lending industry, and new build apartments are then much more a smaller subset therein. So the average loan to value on a new build apartment is considerably lower than new build houses, which obviously will be a factor and essentially mitigates or militates against the kind of effective demand for new build apartments.
Anyone else? Can I thank Kevin and David for those answers, and thank you for accommodating our tight timing today. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Charles Rowe, Director of Mortgages at UK Finance. I'm also a former member of the Commonhold Council.
I'm Hannah Gurga, Director General of the ABI, which represents the UK's insurance and long-term savings sector.
I'm Robert Stevens. I head up property risk for Nationwide Building Society, and I previously sat on the Commonhold Technical Working Group.
And I'm John Godfrey. I'm the MD for Public Affairs, Policy and Economic Research at TheCityUK, which is a member organisation representing the financial ecosystem.
Good morning. Thank you all for attending. In May 2024, the then Housing Minister, Lee Rowley, said that the department had seen no substantive evidence that suggested a ground rent cap would present a systematic risk to the operation of pension funds or the financial markets. Do you disagree, and if so, what evidence do you have to the contrary? Can I start with Charles?
In terms of the ground rent cap, as we said in our response to the previous consultation on this, we recognise that there could be some unintended consequences of this cap, particularly in terms of the long-term savings and the pension sector. But from a mortgage lender perspective, which is where UK Finance represents 120 mortgage lenders, certainty over things like lease costs and also in terms of ground rent helps with affordability assessments and provides a surety for those borrowers in terms of the cost that they could pay for that property that they could be leasing.
Well, the ABI represents members who are major investors in the UK economy, including those who are providing pensions to millions of customers across the country. And I think if you look at the government's own policy statement, which it issued alongside the draft bill, it estimates an impact of somewhere between 10 and 12.7 billion pounds. We've not yet seen the government's full impact assessment, which is disappointing because we'd hoped to have had that detail to support this committee's inquiry. But I can certainly say that there is an impact on the firms that we represent. And as well as the impact on individual businesses, I think more broadly the blanket nature of the proposals that the government has brought forward raise important questions about predictability and certainty of the UK's legal framework, and those have implications for the confidence for investors making long-term decisions, and not just overseas investors but UK investors. The companies that I'm representing are UK domiciled businesses making decisions around long-term investment for pensions in the UK.
So from a nationwide perspective, we've had policies around ground rents for the last decade, which has allowed us to be able to lend on the majority of leasehold properties. So we haven't seen ground rents be a significant barrier for us facilitating mortgage lending. And the potential cap, again, would fall probably under the limits of the majority of the ground rents that we see on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I agree with the points made, particularly by Hannah Gurga, about the impact. And the concerns in the pension industry and the investor side of this are really a broad concern and a matter of principle about retrospection. And those who studied the manifesto that the government was elected on read that the goal was to tackle unfair ground rents, and I think the industry is supportive of that as a goal. But the concern really is that a blanket cap retrospectively of £250, resulting in a transfer of value out of the pension system of between 10 and 12.5 billion pounds, is not a proportionate response to that goal. And it's also not a fair response in our view, because it ignores the fact that the leasehold world is not homogeneous. There are a variety of different types of leaseholder in there, and in particular 41% of leaseholders are not owner-occupiers or first-time buyers or any of that type of individual. They are themselves private landlords. And so £5 billion is being taken from pensioners and delivered as a windfall to landlords, with the greatest value accruing to those who are leaseholders in the most expensive properties, often in London, and quite substantially not UK citizens.
Just to come back on what you just said, though, Mr. Gurga, Mr. Rowan, Mr. Godfrey particularly, Lord Gove told this committee a couple of weeks ago that significantly less than 1% of investment would be involved in ground rent. So, I mean, that doesn't sound like it's going to bring down the Western economy to me. Can you suggest why he's wrong, or is he wrong?
I don't think it's the headline percentage that's the issue. It is the point of principle. When investors are taking decisions around very long-term investments, and as I say, in the case of the members I represent, we're talking about paying pensions for decades into the future. It's extremely important that they have certainty around the contracts that they've entered into. And in the case of pensions, you have to make sure that the assets are matching the liabilities. That's why predictable cash flows, certain cash flows are really critical. So it's not so much that headline percentage figure that's the issue, but the impact of retrospective action that is extremely unusual in the UK. It's unusual in most jurisdictions, but it's really an unprecedented scale of intervention that the government's contemplating.
That's something that our members that have an interest in this have reflected to us as well, in terms of the impact of the retrospection on this, in terms of the uncertainty. In terms of the numbers, I rely on my colleagues at TheCityUK and also in terms of the ABI with those further details. But as Mr. Stevens said, from a mortgage lender perspective, the cap does help in terms of of that certainty over the cost that those homeowners and potential purchasers could incur when buying that property.
Could I add, Chair, to that the greater the risk or perceived risk of legal uncertainty, the higher the premium that investors would expect to earn on their investments. And this, I think, is particularly germane if you think about a government which is encouraging or perhaps trying to force pension funds to invest more in the United Kingdom. It doesn't feel consistent with that objective, but it also, if you think about the next time a government comes around the pension funds and asks for greater commitment to, for example, infrastructure or energy systems or whatever it may be, those investors will be thinking, do I really want to do that, given this government and the government generally in the UK is not averse to changing the rules in hindsight?
I'll make one final point, which is that you said, Mr. Gurga, that it's unprecedented intervention. However, what I was suggesting also unprecedented is that actually it's a 40-year sort of timeline for this to come to an end. It's also been the manifesto of two successive election-winning parties, 2019, 2024. So you these investors have had a significant notice that this was likely and coming. So I would just push back and say, why is nearly 50 years of notice of the end of your ground rent such a significant barrier to investment in UK PLC?
So when it comes to pensions, it's both prudent, but also the regulatory framework requires this matching of assets to liabilities. So this is across multiple decades for customers of our members. And the removal of that income stream has implications for that matching, which requires a transition period. I think in the government's own statements that it issued alongside the bill, it acknowledges that any shorter transition period than the one they proposed would have a more damaging impact, not only on investor confidence, but also on freeholders potentially, perhaps leading to insolvency. I think you've heard already before this committee evidence talking about examples previously in the UK where there have been very long transition periods. I believe a 60-year transition period in the case of the 1977 Rent Charges Act, which goes to show that when it comes to interfering with property rights and contracts, that it does take time to unwind these positions. So I can understand and sympathise with the position that leaseholders may find themselves in, and that's why a proportionate approach is needed, and that balance to be struck between delivering what was in the manifesto, which in our reading was to tackle unfair and unaffordable ground rents, while also preserving those property rights, which we feel the government's not got right in terms of that balance because of the blanket approach it's taken. It's simply not targeted or proportionate enough.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. To all of the panel, what would you characterise as a greater risk to the economy at the moment? The situation in the Middle East or this 40-year transition?
I think it's the risk in the Middle East in terms of the short term.
I would agree. There's a short-term risk arising from the conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Can't disagree with that.
Full house. Thank you. Look, I appreciate it might sound like an odd question. The point I'm trying to make here is that when you're talking about pensions and investments, uncertainty always exists. None of us knew a month ago the situation that we would be in now. So you're all saying that this causes grave uncertainty, but you're in a world where you constantly have to adjust to a changing world. Whereas my colleague Sean has just set out, we're talking here about a 40-year transition. So do you understand how it seems to members of the public, some of whom have sat behind you, have had a very bad experience with the current leasehold system, that this seems actually very manageable and very proportionate compared to all the other uncertainty and risk you have to deal with?
In terms of the proposals in the bill, the 40-year transition provides a longer transition period than the previous bill that was consulted on 2 years ago. But say from the point of view of as Hannah said, those investors that are invested in for the long term, I think that is the challenge that they face in relation to that match or mismatch of assets and liabilities in the short and the medium term.
Of course, I can appreciate the position in which leaseholders find themselves in, but equally, we have investors who have entered into lawful contracts which are professionally advised, which are supporting pension payments for customers over multiple decades. The members I represent are not making short-term speculative investments. Of course, they consider market risk and what might happen in terms of the value of investments. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect investors to prepare for a government intervention that would effectively wipe out billions of value in a blanket approach without compensation.
Just to add to that, if I may, Chair, there are clearly controllable risks and there are non-controllable risks, and we in our sector can't do very much about what happens in the Middle East, but we don't necessarily want to add unnecessary risk which is in our control to impose or not impose. So I think that's one point. The other point is that the question from the manifesto was really about addressing unfair ground rents, and this goes way beyond that. And it is arguably not a fairness result to create a £5 billion windfall for private sector landlords, and indeed not a fair result particularly to retrospectively revisit contracts which people moving into retirement homes, which is a particular concern here, have entered into based on a choice whether to pay an upfront premium for where they live or pay over time through a higher ground rent reflecting use of the common parts. So people have taken very clear and rational and sensible decisions based on the law as it stood. And to add a risk that we don't need to add is probably unhelpful for those people. So 40 years, shorter than that, would be a grave risk. It's in our decision-making power to minimise the unnecessary risk for the sector.
And just on that final point, I think from the answers you've all given, 40 years seems reasonable and fair. I think there's some query about whether the 250 limit is fair and reasonable. If not 250, what figure would you suggest?
Well, we wouldn't at this point want to start trading figures, but I think the starting point for this is a much better analysis of what is the composition of the leasehold market, and how you reflect the breadth of that composition in arriving at a figure. If you are putting into one bracket an apartment in London which sells for £10 million and which under these proposals of £250 would give the owner of that apartment a windfall of somewhere between £350,000 and £550,000, that is a very much greater windfall than anything you could deliver for a struggling first-time buyer who's worried about ground rent. So I think you need to base a new approach to the figure on a better analysis of what the leasehold market actually consists of, who those owners are, what they're using those properties for, and how valuable those properties are. There is a register coming in this summer of leaseholds, and that should provide a good database on which to start doing that work.
Will, you want to come in?
Thank you. John, this is really helpful to hear. Do you think the government should introduce a tiering approach for ground rents where, let's say hypothetically, we have one higher than 250 for the luxury market, as you outlined, and a lower one for the first-time buyer, the more standard market? We've heard earlier today that actually ground rent cap of 250, a lot of ground rent is lower than that. So do you think actually ground rent should be lower for some cap, but a higher cap for the more complicated, the more luxury market?
Well, as I've said, there would need to be much more analysis to figure out what those figures should be, but there is a very strong argument for having a differentiated number depending on the nature and the use of the property. So I think that is something that should be explored properly before this bill reaches the statute book.
Just come in on that. In terms of the where the de minimis or de maximis limit should sit, I think from a lender perspective, one of the things that we're aware of, and certainly from my engagement with leaseholders, particularly those that have been involved in flats with cladding, is where that freeholder has used the ground rent as almost a proxy for increasing an additional service charge to cover things like building remediation for building safety. And that is where we have seen in isolated cases where that has happened, and this is where we're supportive of this cap on the ground rent for those leaseholders that are impacted by that.
Okay. Moving on, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but do you have any concerns about the financial impact of a ground rent cap, or are you more concerned by the principles of not interfering in existing leases? Who wants to take that?
Shall I go first? Well, I think we've got concerns on both because, as I say, in the government's own policy statement, it indicates even with a 40-year transition, there is an estimated impact of between 10 and 12.7 billion pounds. That is not trivial. But there's also the longer-term consequences for investment decisions in the UK. And I think once you take a decision that has retrospective impact, it really weakens the overall position and the perspective that investors have about the UK as a place to invest. We know that the country needs a lot of investments in our infrastructure, in our housing. ABI members have been making those investments, but the retrospective change is so broad that it really does draw into question whether the UK can be relied upon contractually under rule of law, something that historically has been a real strength for this country.
The attitude of certainly our members who are investors in this has been that yes, they are on side with trying to address egregious practices such as they still exist in ground rents, addressing unfairness, but to try to address that through a £250 cap, which is a pretty arbitrary number. We're not quite sure how that number has been reached, by the way. But that...
I'll help you with that.
Please do.
The point at which ground rents exceed either 0.1% of the property value or 250 is a common standard at which mortgage lenders have traditionally started imposing additional checks. So I think it's been led by the industry, where you as an industry decide that requires further work.
I think there is a question about 0.1 the value of the property. I mean, that's based on an average £250,000, clearly. And that, I think, is a rather out-of-date figure. It's certainly not a figure which is applicable across the whole of the country. So that is slightly misleading. And the view in the industry is also that this has become conflated with an issue about assured short-hold tenancy, which has been dealt with as a separate policy issue. So there is a degree of confusion about the £250, although I have read those arguments too, Chair. So I think to the point about are we concerned about the numbers or are we concerned about the principle? Yes, it's both. These numbers need to be very much better analysed and better explained. Certainly, the industry would be willing to cooperate and to work with government on cases of egregious unfairness and trying to make the system better, as was promised in the manifesto. But we don't think that this kind of massive transfer of value, quite often to people who I can't imagine the government had in mind as beneficiaries when it was writing this policy, is the right way to go about it.
I mean, I think there seems to be a bit of a logical jump that I think is happening, which is you're going, like, these investments are not really doing anything for British PLC, right? There is no productivity gain to the British economy. There is no GDP growth from ownership of the freeholds on these flats. So I get the retrospective problem, but do you actually think that a government going after this kind of rent-seeking behaviour would actually decrease confidence in people's willingness to invest in good, pro-growth, productivity-gaining investment in the UK, which any government of all political stripes would be supportive of? Or do you think investors would generally not be able to see the difference between those two things?
Shall I go first on that one? I mean, I think there is a little bit of a myth about what freeholders do and what is the role of the freeholder, and quite often the role of the freeholder is to act as a steward for the building, to ensure that it is safe, that it is insured, and that these conditions are met. So it is not a nil economic gain.
A great job at that, though, have they? I mean, if you've got to set that as the standard,
that is the stewardship goal, and the majority of them do a good job. The problem that you have in trying to address that is clearly that going through a transition into a Commonhold, you will find that the economic model of stewardship is much harder to deliver in a mixed tenure building. Let's say you have some who are common holders, some who are leaseholders. How is somebody going to provide the common services and the insurance and the safety and all the other things that need to be done by somebody without the benefits of scale of having a larger part of that building under their stewardship? So there is a bigger role for freeholders, and the good ones certainly do that. On productivity, it is less obvious, as you say, than, for example, investing in equities, but the regulations do require, as Hannah has explained, that investment goes in on a matched basis, and these things do need to be invested in by somebody.
The argument I'm struggling with is, we've been talking about this for many years. I think the industry really, I get your point, I think the industry really knew we were going to come along and do this eventually. Somebody, one party of one political stripe, has been in 2 manifestos. Mm-hmm. Eventually somebody was going to come along and do something like this retrospectively. I struggle to see why that would then convince people that we would then start doing things retrospectively with bits of the economy which we think are far more productive and far more beneficial. I'm not convinced that investors don't see the difference between a government doing retrospective policy on something like this and doing retrospective policy on other things that we want to encourage more investment into.
So I represent a broad cross-section of firms, and I can say with confidence that those who are not in any way connected to ground rents are deeply concerned about retrospective change of this kind, because they are taking very long-term decisions around where to place their money. I'm also aware that some of my members, when they travel internationally to seek funding for their own UK businesses, are also getting questions from overseas investors about the UK's approach to retrospective intervention. And I think it's extremely important that this committee encourages the government to be mindful about this sort of intervention, because whether you like it or not, overseas and domestic investors join dots. So it's not just this intervention. We have seen the announcement about the government changing the tariff for renewables contracts from RPI to CPI. That's also had other types of investor raising questions about retrospection. And I think the concern is not the reform itself in this case. It's the blanket approach that the government is taking. It's because retrospectively rewriting contracts is extremely unusual, particularly for the UK, and that creates a policy risk that goes well beyond leasehold. And it matters because this government is trying to actively seek investment in infrastructure, housing, to support growth, and undermining confidence in the stability of the UK's legal and regulatory framework really cuts across that objective.
We've got about 10 minutes left for this panel, so I'm going to move gently on.
Charles, keen to come to you first, because previously UK Finance have said that moving to Commonhold prematurely risks creating operational disruption across the housing system, undermining the government's ambition to deliver 1.5 million homes. I mean, that's quite a bold statement. We've heard testimony over the last few weeks of people who are living in a completely dysfunctional leasehold system at the moment. Can you explain to us why you think this is the problem?
Of course, yeah. So I think in terms of consumer, if you think the whole ecosystem, but start off with the consumer first of all, I think there's a need for a consumer awareness campaign to make sure consumers understand what Commonhold is. We know from our engagement with particularly first-time buyers and home movers, the confusion between freehold and leasehold at the moment, and then bringing in that third tenure, what that will mean, particularly in relation to setting up those Commonhold groups for those new units. We are supportive of the transition for new homes in terms of that would be the first place to start, but we're also conscious of the fact that there is the Leasehold Reform Act going through at the moment, or bill going through, and those changes need to be implemented, and the government has consulted on improvements to the home buying and selling process. And then if you look down further down the route in relation to leasehold and Commonhold conversion, or leasehold conversion to Commonhold, how that would work. So we'd like to see it in a phased approach. So in terms of the new build, first of all, implementation then of the Leasehold Reform Bill, consider looking at the priorities for home buying and selling, and then doing the existing transition. I've talked about the consumer, but also let's not forget people like estate agents, valuers, the surveying and the conveyancing community as well, who this tenure is not particularly common. So they would need educating as well and bringing up to speed in terms of what would happen, which we anticipate would take a minimum of 2 years. In terms of making that transition to those new builds, talking to our lenders as well, they would they would need to make changes to their systems to be able to facilitate the operation of Commonhold, and also do the staff training in-house. There has been some concern around why don't more lenders lend on Commonhold at the moment. That's primarily because of a supply and demand in terms of the demand there isn't there for it. But as we saw if I take a parallel situation was in buy-to-let properties, when it was buy-to-let limited companies. When that first started, there was very few mortgage deals and mortgage offers for limited company buy-to-let organisations. That is now much more wide-ranging because lenders have adopted to the system and adapted their processes. But Mr. Stevens has got some practical experience of dealing with Commonhold because he and I were talking about this only last month.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ray. So, as Nationwide, we already lend upon Commonhold, as was mentioned. It's limited in the number of buildings that are out there at the moment. So, we've had some practical challenges when it actually comes to the ecosystem around finding a conveyancer who was able to act, or finding a valuer who was able to value the property and understand the tenure. So, I think all of the points that were just made, we would reiterate that there needs to be some time to scale the ecosystem across the whole journey to ensure that consumers fully understand what they're taking on and the differences in the tenure, because we see today a lot of people don't necessarily understand the differences between freehold and leasehold, let alone adding a third tenure into that mix. From our perspective as a lender, I think the other challenges, apart from those of scale and building the systems which would need to be done, is also understanding what the costs are going to look like from an affordability perspective, who's going to manage the building, and do the people who are taking on that understand the reality of, especially in large blocks, being able to sort of understand the details of things like building safety and the impact that would have. So one of the things we're also considering or looking at, would be calling for, is how it works in relation to managing agents and the regulation of them to ensure that buildings are maintained and are in a situation where we know we've got no concerns around our customers being able to live safely in them.
Can I come back? Look, so Rob, I'm pleased that you're already lending to Commonhold, and Charles, I think your answer when you're talking about consumer awareness and education, I agree with all of that. That has to be an important part of this reform. And to be honest, there is a little bit of a contradiction in some of this quite dramatic language that's been used in written evidence about this undermining the whole housing system. I hope the panel can agree that this is a reform that, if done properly and in conjunction with consumer awareness and education, is absolutely deliverable and not something that would threaten to undermine everything else that's going on in the housing market. Is that fair?
In terms of the transition is going to be a big piece of work. The concern from a lender perspective is the impact that this could have on those existing leaseholds that wish to convert. And when they convert into a Commonhold, what is the process in terms of those lenders that have offered security or got the security on those properties at the moment? What does that mean for those lenders? What assurance do they get that the management company has, particularly in a very large block or a multi-use block, has the relevant expertise, knowledge and insight to be able to discharge their responsibilities correctly without falling foul later down the line? For example, they haven't insured the property, or they're not kept on top of some of the regulations, maybe in relation to building safety. There is also a concern that lenders have that the Commonhold group that are running the premises may decide unilaterally to make changes. They may sell part of for example, sell it for a car park for development, or they may decide that they don't want any short-term Airbnb type rentals in the property. So what does that mean for those people that have invested in that property? What does it mean for the lenders that have security on that property when part of that property has been
But
sold
couldn't a
off?
freeholder do that now? Why is that any different?
Sorry to interrupt, Charles. So I think the point is, at the moment there are mechanisms that we've got in play which inform us if there are going to be changes. For Commonhold to work, we would need a similar framework put in place. So if, for example, as Charles just mentioned, there was going to be a change to the Commonhold agreement that potentially would be detrimental to the property, we would be made aware. So what we're looking here is how we get the same level of assurance around how a building is managed, how it's maintained, and any changes. So that could impact the security, our lending, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we're really saying here.
And similarly, from an insurance perspective, having that transparency will be important. So I think the message is really, as there's little detail on the face of the draft bill around how some of this will be operationalised, it's extremely important that the government engages with industry in its widest sense as the legislation progresses to make sure that that transition is managed effectively, and also that Commonhold associations get the support and guidance that they need.
Yeah, the devil is always in the detail on this stuff, and that's what we're saying.
We've got a couple more minutes left of this panel, so I'm going to cut these answers short. Sean, over to you for your final question.
Mr. Rowe, you previously called for more detail
Yes.
on the conversion process to understand the potential risk for lenders. I'm taking from your comments today, and feel free to correct me, that you haven't had that detail, you don't believe you've got the assurance needed for lenders.
At the moment, lenders would need further reassurance around that, and that was one of the things that we were developing on the Commonhold Council in terms of trying to understand how that conversion would work. But just picking up on one of the comments that my colleagues mentioned earlier is in terms of the regulation of the managing agents. We feel that actually the bill has missed an opportunity there to bring in that regulation, and that is something from a mortgage lending perspective that we would fully support and wholeheartedly get behind, from the point of view of making sure those managing agents were regulated and held to a minimum standard.
To return to a point made last week, though, because I think it was Lord Best was very keen on regulation of managing agents as well, but we heard very clearly from representatives of leaseholders that their concern with regulation is that all the costs will be loaded onto them, and that's why they don't want regulation. They want this. Do you have a challenge to that?
I would say it's horses for courses. You know, we know that there will be some Commonhold blocks where they'll be very happy to manage. There'll be others where they were particularly complex. There may be multi-use. There may be different types of tenancy arrangements in there, which for the layperson they would not be able to. They would probably not want to rise to that challenge. And we believe that it will be outsourced to managing agents, which is why we'd like to see them regulated.
Can I just layer in on that point? Yeah. So I think the key for me here is we're talking about removing complexity from the process. From a lending perspective, what we want to get is the assurance that a building is being managed properly in accordance with legislation. If the route to that is through regulated managing agents, that's brilliant. If we can get it through some other way, we'd also be happy with that. It's sort of the simplicity of getting that confirmation and reassurance through the lending process that we know how a building's being managed.
But what I'm trying to understand is it seems like we get to a situation where as long as the leaseholders pay the bill for sorting this out, you guys are fairly happy. If the shoe's on the other foot, frankly, you're not interested and you'll continue to say that whatever's proposed is not good enough. Is that fair? I
think in terms of any bills that any common holder or leaseholder has to pay, as long as there's transparency in how those bills are calculated, and that the common holders or leaseholders can challenge those, then I think that's a fair way of approaching it.
Yeah, I would echo the same point. From a lender's perspective, we're very keen to ensure that the building's being managed properly, that actions are being taken when there are things like outstanding fire risk assessments, and we also would scrutinise today's service charges. If we thought they were unreasonable, we would have an issue with that. So that doesn't matter from a tenure to tenure. It's more around, is the building being managed correctly?
I thank panel 2 for attending this morning, and that's really informative. Thank you.
I'm Kate Butler. I'm an Assistant Director of Policy at the British Property Federation. We are the membership body for the UK real estate industry.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. My name is James Raynor. I work for Grosvenor Property. I'm the Chief Executive. Grosvenor is a primarily commercial property company with over 75% of our assets in either office or retail. We do have some residential. In London we have 700 affordable homes, 500 private rented, and we're involved also obviously in residential ground rents, but actually this makes up about 1% of our turnover, and we haven't actually granted a new leasehold with a ground rent in the last decade.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. James, earlier this month, Lord Gove told us that leaseholders do not need to have a member of the House of Lords being responsible for their property in order for it to be managed effectively. What do you think of what Lord Gove said?
I think the management, and I think this has been discussed elsewhere, but the management of property which has multiple occupiers in it is a very complicated business. I think that it can be done, but I think we should not assume that just a move into Commonhold is the panacea for all of the issues that have been discussed. I think we need to take into account that different people within a property will have different interests. You know, the approach of somebody who has just moved in versus somebody who's lived there for 10 years to common parts works will be different. The approach to somebody who lives on the first floor versus the 10th floor with regards to lift reparations will also be different, etc., etc. So it is not necessary, but we provide, and freeholders do provide, a range of services, and we think that on our behalf, I won't speak on behalf of others, we do that very well.
Because it can be so complicated, do you think this bill should also regulate managing agents as well?
Yes, I think this is comes to the nub of some of the issues, your question. You know, I think that freeholders can provide all of these services in terms of managing them buildings themselves. That is what we choose to do. Others will subcontract that to managing agents, and I think in here there lies a lot of frustration. So I think that needs to be looked at. I think that when we look at some of the issues, and some of them that I hear about are that they're frankly very shocking, and I feel very sorry for the people involved. I think we have an issue with structural advice on this issue in terms of people going into leaseholds and whether they've been fully informed and they understand about exactly what is going on. And I think that how the management of these properties is undertaken in a fair, transparent and just and frankly more simple way is also something that should be looked at.
I'm pleased to hear you sort of having some sympathy for some of the people involved in some of these bad cases. How's your involvement in the ongoing judicial review litigation about LAFRA, which has delayed the implementation of that act, helping people?
We have constructively engaged with government all the way through on this process, and we have one issue with regards to what is going on with that proposed reform, which we do not agree with, and we think will cause us financial loss, and as a result we are trying to protect our rights on that. In principle, we are very happy with reform in this area and are not against it. We have a very specific issue.
Do you understand why I think MPs and possibly the public are frustrated by LAFRA is being judicial reviewed? There are already threats that this bill, if agreed, would be judicial review, despite the fact it's been in two political parties winning manifestos.
Yeah, of course I understand the frustration, and a lot of the consultation and the time and effort we've put into the consultation is to exactly avoid this situation, because I think that a judicial review is not to be taken lightly, should only be used as a last resort, and we should try everything we can to avoid it. So I'm very pleased with the way that you're approaching all of this discussion in terms of trying to get all the different viewpoints, because I think that will allow you to form a legislation that is in the best interest of all parties and will pass fairly and quickly, I hope.
And that being said, do you think you and some of your colleagues in the sector would judicial review this bill if it was agreed?
Well, as I pointed out, you know, we're not a ground rent investor. We hold some ground rents, but it's not a significant area of business for us. I can imagine, if you think about the panel just before us, there are people with significant financial interests at stake, and they are going to want to protect their interests, but I'm certainly not capable of speaking on their behalf.
What does your views on this draft bill?
Well, there are a number of things in the bill that we support. I think we're at the BPF for tenure agnostic. We think that Commonhold, if introduced, can bring long-term benefits if done sensibly, and we would echo the things that have been said by previous witnesses today, but also throughout these sessions on what needs to be done to make sure that it is introduced sensibly. Our primary concern is around the ground rent cap, the proposed ground rent cap, which we don't believe is proportionate to the issue that the government
What
is
figure would
trying
you
to.
suggest is fair and reasonable?
We don't want to see a cap as introduced. We think that if the government wants to take the time to find ground rents that are genuinely unaffordable and prevent mortgage affordability, then it should undertake the work to do that. What is proposed in the bill isn't proportionate to the issue that the government's trying to address, nor to the manifesto commitment, and as other witnesses have said, is an unprecedented interference in existing property rights and is detrimental to the UK's reputation as a safe place for investment.
Will mentioned potential phasing or having step change depending on the property value. Is that something that you consider being appropriate? Because I think I'm an opposition MP, but my imagination is that the government would want a simple model that everyone could understand, hence why they've gone for the T50 40-year transition. And extremists, in some cases, sounds like that's going to be disproportionate from what the evidence we're hearing, both from yourselves and others. So what model would you suggest?
I think I sympathise with the preference perhaps towards simplicity, but I think we need to go back to the issue that the government is trying to address here in the manifesto commitment, which was to tackle unaffordable ground rents. And from what we understand, those are ground rents that affect the ability for leaseholders to be able to access mortgage finance. A cap that, perhaps a cap that is broad-based doesn't just affect those, and there's no evidence that we can see from the policy statement that the government has identified ground rents that genuinely impact mortgage availability. We know, and you've mentioned previously, Chair, a £250 cap, again, that's in the context of the Housing Act, and the assured short-hold tenancy trap, which has been removed by the Renters' Rights Act. The policy statement also sets out that 0.1% of the property's value is where lenders start becoming more restrictive, but that doesn't quite paint a nuanced picture. If you look at the top 6 lenders, for example, which represent 70% of the lending market, 2 are silent on nominal ground rent restrictions. 1 provides finance up to 0.1%, 2 up to 0.2%, and 1 up to 0.5%. So it's not quite as simple a picture as a cap sort of based on 250 across the board, or even 250 in some instances, 1,000 in others. It's still not proportionate to the issue that the government's trying to address, which is that ability to access mortgages as we understand it.
Did you want to come in at this point?
I just wanted to step back slightly, and at the heart of this, I think the truth is that these reforms in the end won't satisfy everybody, because politics and the rule of governing is also about choices, and this this very important reform is also about recognising that it's one thing that yourself, Grosvenor and other businesses have the facility, they have the money to be able to take these reforms to judicial review, versus the everyday man or woman who is living in the property, unable to access the mortgage that they need, unable to get a good home to live in, unable to make simple choices for themselves. And the ambition of this government is to increase that ability for every person to get a decent home to live in, and to remove the barriers that the current system hold for them. And there's a challenge here within ground rents, which is what are the leaseholders receiving in return for those ground rents. And so, is it morally defensible that businesses like yourselves are using their resources to challenge the government's rights to change the law, when that is at the heart of what we're trying to achieve?
So, as I said, we, from over a decade, haven't issued a leasehold with a ground rent attached to it, and nor do we have any of the escalating ground rents that you refer to. So I think that there's a number of questions here, but people have talked about what do you get for the ground rent. Well, the reality is that the ground rent is part of the purchase price. So the question is, how is the price of the flat purchased versus an upfront payment versus an ongoing payment? And I think that, in many cases, the ongoing payment is about reducing the entry price, which actually is to facilitate the acquisition of the flat in the first place. So the intention, I think, to some extent is very logical in that. I said we don't do it, but that's the position. I think that, if I look at leasehold reform and I think about it on the basis of probably three principles, I think the first is the ground rent should absolutely not be a hidden mechanism to create windfall gains. It's not about that. I think if there is a ground rent, it's about how you proportion the price of entry for buying the flat, and it could be a lot simpler and a lot clearer. And that, I think, then points to the issues that have been brought up in the previous panel, where on the basis that there is an upfront payment and a deferred payment, changing the deferred payment aspect does inherently represent a transfer of value.
Anyone else? I thank James and Kate for coming this morning. Again, very helpful. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Sebastian O'Kelly, Director of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, which is a registered charity, and the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, which was very active with Sir Peter Bottomley, who remains one of our trustees. And of course, Justin Madders is now the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group.
Yeah, morning. My name is Martin Boyd. I'm here today as the chair of the government-funded Leasehold Advisory Service. I am also chair of trustees of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. I am also chair of an RMC of a high-rise building in Kingston where we have 240 flats, a 900-seat theatre, 8 commercial units, 2 rivers, 3 bridges, a large public area, and an awful lot of responsibility.
Good morning. My name is Shula Rich, and I represent today the Federation of Private Residence Associations, which is the only association representing organised leaseholders within blocks. I'm also the chair of Brighton Hove and District Leaseholders, which has been going since 1976, and I see approximately, as my voluntary work, at least 500 leaseholders a year, which adds up to probably 15 to 20,000 issues over the 30 years that I've been involved with leasehold. I also wrote the first courses for managing agents working with the National Federation of Property Professionals and drafted a national contract for leasehold management. That's the beginning.
My name is Sue Phillips, and I'm here representing Shared Ownership Resources. Shared Ownership Resources is a registered charity which offers information and signposting from a shared owner perspective, and which advocates for the best interests of shared owners.
And you're welcome all. Chris.
Thanks. I might have to run off a little bit early, so I'll apologise in advance for that. I'm going to come first to Sebastian, if that's all right. For many years, your organisation has been at the forefront of the campaign for Commonhold. Why do you think, sort of from first principles, Commonhold will be better for flat owners than the leasehold system?
Well, to get back to first principles, this is a fight for control of homes. What you've got at the moment is speculators who've come into this market over the past 25 years and have bought up the freeholds. At the scuzzier end of the market, they'll be picking them up at auctions. At the top end of the market, there'll be sophisticated financial transactions. Many of these freeholds are owned offshore. You were expressing frustration that these freeholders wouldn't turn up to address your committee. I've been expressing frustration that they've been hiding their beneficial ownership behind nominee directors, often offshore, for many years. It has been a way of hitching a ride on other people's homes, and it's been systematically abused over the past 25 years. It was a way for big money to get involved in the UK residential property market, which is one of the stellar performing investment assets of the world. Not now, but it was. And it has resulted in the complete disempowerment of ordinary homeowners. You've heard this figure, 41% are buy-to-letters. I wonder where that comes from, frankly. I think it's 41% of new build owners might be buy-to-letters, but it certainly doesn't apply to the 5 million leaseholders out there, many of whom are living in perfectly blameless Victorian conversions with very small ground rents. We've heard a lot of the money this morning talking about this issue, but they should hang their heads in shame, frankly. They were behind the 10-year doubling ground rent scandal. UK finance doled out mortgages on impossible leases with highly aggressive 10-year doubling ground rents, and they still seem to be doing it. My niece owns a £100,000 flat in Salford in Rebecca Long Bailey's constituency. Her ground rent is £470 a year. Why did Halifax issue a mortgage on that? Of course, it's not going to offer a remortgage on it, and no prospective buyer's mortgage lender is going to automatically lend on that either. I think it's a very high ground rent for a 165k flat, and this has happened again and again. One of your MPs talked about the conveyancing process, and MPs, not one solicitor in the doubling ground rent solicitor, not one of the many firms involved, raised the slightest issue with ground rents doubling every 10 years for the first 6 decades, which means that a £250 ground rent ends up at more than £8,000. Those homes were unsellable. This sector provided those, built those homes, and is now trying to talk a whole load of a rather sophisticated argument that, investment in this country is going to dry up, etc., if we don't address this. This battle is about the control of ordinary homes, and homeowners have been right royally shafted, and it must end.
So, just to put the argument to you, so the argument we've heard is, deals, contracts, investments were made in the UK based on, and it is unfair to go back retrospectively. And they would argue costly. 10 to 12 billion was the number we kept having repeated back to us, to the British economy, to make these changes. How would you respond to that?
I think they've done extremely well making hay over the past 25 years. I got involved in this as a national newspaper journalist, and my question was, why does a financier, is a financier like Vincent Cengiz a very probable person to look after your granny in a retirement flat? The reason that he owns the freehold of retirement properties is because it pays out such a huge amount of money in ground rent and other leasehold income streams. I think they've done very well, but this is the battle for control. Control should go to the people who actually pay the service charges. Instead, it's massively difficult to take on these institutions in the courts, as you've already heard, and they use the service charges, incidentally, to defeat the people who are complaining about the service charges. I mean, it's quite Kafkaesque in this sector. So I don't have much sympathy with them. I also think you were very misled, if I may say so, by the representative from TheCityUK talking about retirement ground rents paying for communal aspects of retirement sites. I know a lot about retirement housing. McCarthy and Stone and Churchill Retirement did make this argument in favour of ground rents before the 22 Act, when ground rents were banned, and it failed. But many people, many operators in the retirement sector, like Audley, Legal and General's Urban Renaissance Group, have publicly said that they repudiate ground rents in the retirement sector. And don't have them. Well, they didn't have them before the ban in 2022, so it's not a complete picture. Just
a final question from me. Look, the change to Commonhold, I think you've given a good account of the arguments for that, but it is complex in order to get around many of the collective action problems that it creates, or we have to ensure that the regulations are right in order to do so. Do you have confidence that this bill has got that balance right to ensure we can create a thriving Commonhold system that doesn't run into those problems further down the road?
I think it's a very good first step, but look, let's face it, in Australia, when they introduced strata title, they've had to revisit it a number of times. You're not going to get this right first time, but most important thing is this is the nail in the coffin of the leasehold system, and you're pushing on this is possibly what you don't appreciate. You are actually pushing on a door which is open. You haven't heard from the Berkeley Group plc. You heard from the House Builders Federation, but the Berkeley Group plc has handed over control of Chelsea Bridge Wharf, 1,100 flats across the river, which includes their corporate headquarters, by the way, to a right-to-manage company. So it has ceded control to leaseholders. McCarthy and Stone was talking to us about Commonhold, and I think a very important point buried away in the written submissions to this committee is that the Property Institute, usually the obliging little helpers to freeholders, are supporting the £250 ground rent cap, which is the first time they've broken with the freeholders.
Just a final one, just because you mentioned it, so Sebastian or anybody else that may have knowledge of this, obviously you're right that nailing it first time is going to be very difficult, but we want to get as close as we possibly can. Is there anything we can learn from the Australian experience about how we can ensure that we get it as right as we can first time round?
I don't think I really have enough detail of what the precise evolution of strata, but you know, you're talking about communal living, people squabbling in communal living. That's inevitable. What's squabbling is okay over relatively small amounts of money. What isn't okay is institutionalised rip-offs, which is what we've got at the moment.
Moving on, Andrew.
Yes,
Oh, sorry.
You asked for anybody else to come in here of what we can learn from Australia. One of the most important things that has actually been ignored so far in our legislation is that leaseholders for their funds have less protection than assured short-hold tenants. There is no protection for the client account beyond £50,000 with an RICS surveyor's client account or £120,000 in a bank. In Australia, the leaseholders' funds are all put together and insured, the cost of which is covered by the interest. So all Commonhold unit owners have their reserve funds protected in a fund to the full amount, and the cost of that protection is covered by the interest. That is something huge that could be introduced both for leaseholders and for Commonhold unit owners that we are completely missing. So whilst assured short-hold tenants have their deposits insured, leaseholders have millions and millions of pounds that is not insured in any way.
We need to care about that in the legislation, though. Why wouldn't the common holders organise that themselves through?
It's not available. There is no insurance scheme, no fidelity bond, no cybercrime bond that has, because I've been researching this for my own block where we have £2 million in leaseholders' funds as to what assurances and insurances we can get. It's not commonly available.
Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. We spoke earlier about the transition in the context of what it might mean for pensions funds and the financial. I'm keen to talk about what the transition might mean for the homeowners. And Martin, I was keen to come to you first. So, of course, the Leasehold Advisory Service promotes awareness of the status quo, but I'm really interested in your thoughts on how it could work to promote awareness of Commonhold and what resources might it need to scale up if and when this bill passes.
I wear at least two hats to answer this question. So I was brought in to help radically reform lease to make it more impactful for consumers. Commonhold has always been within the remit of the organisation. There's one thing that hasn't come out so far in any of the discussions on the draft bill, which is relevant to understand. Commonhold was never introduced as a piece of housing legislation. It was introduced under what is now the Ministry of Justice's purview as primarily a land tenure, so it was never actively funded as a housing matter by the Housing Department. Lease was funded to provide some initial advice from the Justice Department at the time. That changed in the middle of 2017 when the legislation moved across, and then shortly after it moved off to the Law Commission. At least we have been preparing for what happens to Commonhold to make sure that people understand about it. For an individual consumer, the level of knowledge that you need to have is not that great, but we obviously need to begin to educate far many more people who will become the directors. Education resources for RNC and RTM directors is inadequate at the moment. It's a big project that we're working on. I have to tell you, though, with my other hat, I will not be moving to Commonhold the day it comes in. And that is because, although it's very cheap for us, and I helped start the campaign in this very room in the middle of 2014, sitting in that chair there, so I'm an absolute massive advocate of it. But I think we have to be realistic and understand that while a lot of people think, yes, I want to move to Commonhold quickly, I can't do it at my site until I pass 3 tests. I've got to believe that the value of my flat is going to go up or at least not go down. I've got to convince at least 50% of the other people who live at my site that they want to convert. And collectively, we have to find the right amount of money so that we can convert. And I don't think that can happen on day one, because we won't get an increase in our property values until we know the market is established. So the government is going to need to support the market initially to make sure that it develops, because it is a new form of tenure.
Thank you, Martin. I want to pick up on that and then open it to the rest of the panel. So, and it's quite striking that you say you wouldn't change on day one.
No, I want to get there as quickly as possible.
No, absolutely, but I think that will be noticed. So then you've laid down the gauntlet to the government that you need to do more to support people, blocks in that early terms. What form would that take? And I'm interested in the views of the panel about how could you see that practically working, because this is really important. Like, we've got to get the legislation right, but it is of no value if we legislate and then there isn't demand for conversion.
I have always said that I would like to see Commonhold as a condition of planning. If there were even preference given to Commonhold under Section 106 agreements, that would be acceptable now within our present legal framework. But if it was said that Commonhold can be a condition of planning for new build, or there would be benefits to developers in offering us Commonhold, then perhaps more of those 1.5 million homes that are planned would actually be Commonhold. And I think what we need to do is to lay the ground and not silo ourselves in one set of laws, but to look outwards so that we can have tenure responsive planning as other countries do.
Sue or Sebastian, any thoughts?
Well, just that shared ownership isn't Commonhold, of course. It's going to exist in parallel with it. It's maybe been shoehorned into it, and I'm sure we'll come to that in later questions.
I see it coming, and I've always seen it coming really from new build, and it's pressure from on developers to do it. Homes England could have put pressure on Homes England about resident management companies and or a co-ownership of the freehold. It hands out grants to our small minority of developers quite a bit, and I'm thinking here of a retirement developer called Platinum Sky, which sells private flats and also shared ownership, but it has extremely onerous leases. Why on earth is Homes England giving grants to developers creating impossible leases? It in the end fined Platinum Skies £250,000 for failures over the scaling up the aspect of shared ownership, and in fact fined them but kept it quiet until Andrew Elson of the Times revealed this through an FOI request. So we've given out public money to disadvantaged consumers. Let's give some public money to support Commonhold. But when I think people see Commonhold at big sites coming through from new development, then there might be an issue for people to convert to it. It is going to take some years, because if you've got share of, like Martin's site is, share of freehold, for goodness sake, it's the most expensive, most valuable enfranchised site in the country. It's going to take some persuading for him to move on to Commonhold. But it will come, but it'll be slow. But the most important thing is you've removed the sort of predation in this area of the market.
Thank you. Last question, Chair. So it seems to me there's a consensus that this is likely to come first by a new build, the value of doing it through the planning system potentially, and also, Sebastian, to your comments a second ago, just once more for the panel, particularly because we have heard from so many frustrated leaseholders in the weeks preceding today, many of whom I think, can't speak for them, but will have in theory a desperation to want to convert to Commonhold if and when the opportunity arises. So just once more on that, if there's any message that you would have for government on how to set up a system that encourages and enables conversion, what would you prioritise for existing?
I'll start with new build, but I'm afraid I've got bad news for you, because I know you talked about your post boxes being full of complaints from leaseholders. I think you're going to get quite a few from Commonholders as well. They are going to bicker amongst themselves. I am not a leaseholder. I am a commonholder and have been a commonholder in another jurisdiction to England and Wales. Thank God I don't own a flat in this jurisdiction. And I mean, a Commonhold meeting is, if there's some good daytime television, I mean, watch that instead, frankly. It is grueling to go through all this, but it's all minor stuff compared with... At the moment, we seem to be very exercised about cigarettes being thrown over the balcony and landing on the roofs of people's cars. You know, that seems to be the issue at the moment that's exciting. So you're going to get down to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, I mean, from your question earlier, I don't think there is a single lawyer in the land or ex-law commissioner who's assisting you who understands all of leasehold law. There are so many different bits of legislation. It is possibly one of the most complex systems we could possibly contrive, and we add layer upon layer to that. Commonhold system is entirely different. You're looking at having a collective interest in the building. It's what we should always perhaps have had in this country. You know, everyone I would expect at my site to understand that the moment we're no longer in the leasehold world, we've got rid of us as a landlord, we all collectively own a building, and we have a vested interest in making sure that that building succeeds. And that's what we don't have in the leasehold world.
To prioritise Commonhold, I have to speak up for leaseholders, because if Commonhold is promoted as better, which I absolutely believe that it is, what we're doing is devaluing the tenure of 5 million or more leaseholders. So let's also look, for the sake of our members, at making leasehold livable. And one of the ways that we can do that, even within this bill, is to make it possible for whole estates to have right to manage, which would also facilitate the move towards Commonhold for whole estates, because presently one can only get right to manage for one set of premises. So what I would like to suggest is that 50% of blocks on an estate could ask for right to manage, or 50% of qualifying leaseholders, which would echo the 50% and smooth the path towards Commonhold, as right to manage was always intended to be a step towards buying one's freehold. So right to manage for whole estates would stop the terrible abuses that have now grown up of freeholders grabbing people's gardens, for example, as they've learned that blocks prior to the settlers' court case are now managing whole estates. They're coming back to people that I know, grabbing gardens, grabbing car parks, and trying to take back control. So if we're going to make the path towards Commonhold viable, let's set the ground right in allowing big estates to also get right to manage with far less complication than there is at present, where it actually is not allowed.
Before I come to Andrew, there's been various comments about Commonhold and how easy it is to get to that stage. Do you think converted to Commonhold should be made default outcome of a collective enfranchisement, or should leaseholders have to explicitly vote for conversion? Anyone want to take that?
Become default, absolutely yes. Should leaseholders vote on conversion? Of course. If only 50% of a site wants to convert to Commonhold, though, we do have to consider carefully how those who are choosing not to convert are likely to behave. The last thing we want to do is to create a system where we replace the third-party freeholder with a set of disputes between the leaseholders on a site and the common holder on a site.
The 50% is very hard to get in large blocks and on large estates, because the number of absent owners, I think 18% of new builds, there are Chinese owners, another almost equal people from Hong Kong. So if we could look at the definition of the qualifying leaseholder and perhaps think if they could be UK based, So that doesn't rule out large investors in several flats, for example, but what it does mean is that people who are impossible to get hold of can't spoil it for other people looking for a 50% that they will never get. So that would obviously be a huge help. And so we want to redefine the qualifying leaseholder as being UK-based.
Could I just add to that? Add something to that? I mean, yes, there are an awful lot of baby boomer generation investors in leasehold and also from overseas, but I think that's an anomaly of the past 25 years. It wasn't the case before then, and I don't think it's going to be the case now. We're only producing sub 20,000 new flats a year at the moment. It is not a very attractive investment market. Even the ground rent investors here said you can't sell ground rents for love nor money. This is a feature of the British housing market which I think is dying. UK residential property is not the stellar investment asset that it was.
In our evidence, we spoke about the impact of Commonhold on shared owners, but also the impact of shared ownership on Commonhold. And another aspect that's relevant to this question is that, of course, shared owners won't be qualifying leaseholders, and there are situations in which they may have no votes at all. We'll come back to that later, I'm sure. So the number of shared ownership units or homes in a block or development could be very significant to these kinds of questions, whether they're few pepper-potted, whether there are a large amount in any particular block or development.
Moving on to Andrew Cooper.
Thank you. And so you're correct, we are indeed turning to questions of shared ownership. So currently all shared ownership homes are leasehold, and they've not, under the current Commonhold legal framework, they're not able to benefit from that at all by the nature of how it's set up. And I think the intention in the draft bill is that although shared owners will continue to be leaseholders, you'll be able to have those specific types of leases within the Commonhold block. How confident are you with the draft bill and how it's written now that shared owners will be able to fully embrace and benefit from Commonhold?
With the proviso that there's a great deal of detail that's missing from the draft bill that may be added in secondary legislation, which makes it even more complicated to answer this question. But the short answer is no, they won't be confident they can embrace it because they're not going to be common holders. I said earlier that it looks as if shared ownership has been shoehorned into Commonhold. Commonhold doesn't bring leasehold to an end for shared owners, as you said, and it doesn't tackle the unique set of challenges that they encounter as a very particular subset of leaseholders or short tenants, which is obviously a moving picture with other legislation. Some of the issues that are most important for shared owners are that it offers a meaningful pathway to full home ownership, and we could substitute Commonhold for full home ownership, but there's nothing to make Commonhold a more likely outcome than full home ownership is at the moment. The statistics show that there are very, very low rates of staircasing to 100%, so it seems there's nothing to make Commonhold more likely as an outcome than full home ownership is at the moment. Ongoing financial sustainability is important to shared owners. It seems that there are some aspects of the bill that might be problematic in that regard, and I'll come to those in a moment. And another problem for shared owners is the existence of viable exit routes, and I think here we might be looking at even more two-tier markets than we have at the moment that might be create even more problems in terms of exit from shared ownership. So it could exacerbate problems directly. I won't get into detail and come back to these, but just sort of as a summary, ground rent in the bill could be problematic as it's set up at the moment, or the ambiguities around it. The initial repair period could cause problems. The loss of some existing avenues for complaints and redress could be problematic. There's been reference to squabbles, and I mean, obviously there are differences between people living in the same area, the same properties, the same blocks, the same developments. That's human nature. But I think that there's a diversity of interests between common holders who've bought on the open market and shared owners who by definition have come into their homes via an affordable home ownership scheme and who have a different kind of stake in their home, particularly given low rates of staircasing to 100%. So maybe there's sort of structural issues here which are likely to increase the possibility of a lack of alignment of interests as the bill is set up at the moment. So Commonhold could exacerbate problems for shared owners as it stands at the moment, directly through the kind of issues I've mentioned, indirectly through perhaps the creation of additional two-tier market where shared ownership or some forms of shared ownership or some size shares, because obviously shared ownership is complex, but some forms of shared ownership may be unattractive to buyers or more importantly to lenders, which is the same thing really, in some respects. So this was not an inevitability. We're looking at substantive legislative reform, and it offered and offers an important opportunity to review and to improve shared ownership so that it delivers on what it promises: the pathway to full home ownership, the affordability, thereby increasing satisfaction, which is very low at the moment per tenant satisfaction measures. And I think I'll end. How you might do that is outside our technical expertise, but I was interested in Professor Sue Bright's evidence to this committee where she said, and I quote, there are numerous documented problems with the sale of the misnamed shared ownership. This seems a timely moment to review how shared ownership can be delivered within a Commonhold system. Shared Commonhold, delivered potentially through a trust that will provide a fairer and more robust route into home ownership. So I think there are more conversations to be had about how shared ownership sits within Commonhold reform to the benefit of everybody, Commonholders and shared owners.
It sounds like that you don't think that the bill's anywhere near where it needs to be at the moment then.
No, well, in a number of respects. Ground rent, it seems that there's some ambiguity, A, about how ground rent is defined, full stop, but also as to whether shared owners will be excluded from the benefit of caps on ground rent when it comes to ground rent on the landlord's share. And this is important because you will have seen the London Assembly Housing Committee's evidence, which points out that in their investigation into service charges in London, they found that shared owners were, what did they say? The median ground rent paid by respondents who were leaseholders in shared ownership properties were 42% higher than other respondents, other leaseholders. So ground rent is an issue. It's not necessarily the most important issue for shared owners. A lot of people say service charges are a bigger issue, but per Home England's guidance, ground rent was never meant to be part of the package for shared ownership, but it's crept in, and in some cases ground rent is problematic. So for those shared owners for whom ground rent is a problem, the bill doesn't seem to offer reassurance.
So with the bill as written at the moment, what circumstances do you think that shared owners alone should exercise votes in a Commonhold association, and when do you think that the vote should sit with the registered provider?
I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it strikes an aspect of shared ownership that creates a lot of dissatisfaction. So regardless of the size of their share, which under the new model could be 10%, shared owners are liable for 100% of the costs, except under the initial repair period, where the housing provider contributes up to £500 towards qualifying costs and is responsible for external structural repairs. So then you've got a dilemma, because as things stand at the moment, it seems there's a possibility that shared owners could be excluded from voting rights in a Commonhold association for 10 years. 10 years. I mean, that's a long time. Should the vote be divided? It really depends how much of the costs are actually borne by the received provider or the housing association landlord. Because part of the criticism of this new model when it came out was that surely those costs would have been covered by new build warranties and guarantees. Was it a meaningless offer anyway? So I think in order to be able to answer this question, one would need a lot more data about, are housing associations actually paying substantial sums of money on structural and external repairs during that 10-year period, or are shared owners set to miss out on a vote for no good and meaningful reason? And if they're not, how would you allocate it? I mean, if a shared owner has a 10% share, does that put them in a different position than if they've got a 75% share, an 80% share? So I think, again, there are all kinds of questions. One of the reasons that we've recommended a task force in our recommendations is this is far too little time to even scratch the surface of the issues that are raised by shared ownership for Commonhold. And I think it needs to be looked at in detail.
To be fair, in the bill, it doesn't. It hasn't set this out yet, has it? In the bill, it says that that the Secretary of State would make regulations, so they'll do it through secondary legislation to define where that would sit. So, is it your view then that a task force should be set up, or some body should be set up to actually look into this, to define what that secondary
It
legislation
is
should
my
look like.
view
Is that what you're arguing?
that there are so many issues around the relationship between Commonhold and shared ownership, and what one wouldn't want to see is shared ownership brought into Commonhold with none of the existing problems with the tenure being tackled. It would be such a missed opportunity. So I think there would be two aspects for a whatever form that took, a task force, a working group to look at. A, how do we take the opportunity to ensure that shared ownership is structured to deliver what it's intended to deliver, and how do we do that so it integrates with Commonhold to the benefit of Commonholders and shared owners?
Conscious of time, I'll just ask you one last thing, if that's all right. Do you think that there will be any differences between people who are on older persons shared ownership versus, I guess, the other type, the more mainstream new model shared ownership, that are relevant to how this bill will operate?
We raised this issue, and I saw it also occurred in some other written evidence to the committee. Without wanting to make any kind of generalisations about people who go into shared ownership, some of them will be there over a period of time and may, over that period of time, develop age-related conditions that just make it unrealistic for them to take on the kind of complex decision-making that is associated with being a member of a Commonhold association. It does seem that there are questions to be asked around older person shared ownership, particularly extra care older person shared ownership, where by default people require extra care. That's not necessarily a demographic that's perhaps going to be inclined to want to participate in these kind of collective decision-making processes. There are absolutely questions to be asked there, and perhaps with some other variants of shared ownership as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So during these hearings over recent weeks, we've heard a number of perspectives, particularly around whether this bill should also include something around managing agents and regulation of managing agents, as well as perspectives around the Law Commission's recommendations around right to manage. So I'm just really interested from any of the panel, your views as to whether you would like to see either of those areas included within this legislation, or if there is anything else that you think is missing in the current bill, having taken on what Sue's just outlined specifically for the shared ownership model.
Yes, if I might reply to that. I think that managing agents should have a qualification, and that qualification can be available from many places, from the Institute of Works and Facilities Management, from the TPI, from the College of Estate Management. And I know that the mental health, for example, of managing agents has been documented as being one of the worst occupations in the country. Therefore, better training is going to make them better managers. So you can regulate and you can qualify managing agents, but you can't regulate the blocks and say that they must take a regulated or a qualified managing agent on. So I would like to see a range of good and high academic and practical qualifications for managing agents, and it should be shown that these may be the people of choice, but one single managing agent is not always suitable for particularly a large development. Even in a block of 109 like my own, we prefer an on-site manager. We prefer our own accountants and bookkeepers who can be welded into a team with proper procurement practices. So there are things that have been left out of the education of managing agents in a practical sense, in particular procurement policies and guarantees and fidelity bonds. But all power to the institutions that are offering better qualifications, and I hope that it makes them better agents and the agents of choice, but not the agents of compulsion.
Well, you heard from the money earlier, and they've all been talking about regulation of managing agents. I think it's a very much a secondary thing. When it comes to reforming leasehold, experience teaches us that if you make the bill too complicated, it will get entangled in endless lobbying, and it will be rendered impotent. That's what happened to the 2002 Act. I would leave the regulation of managing agents for a later date. The most important regulation for managing agents is the people who pay the bills can have the power of hire and fire, and that's far more important than anything, any regulatory regime. At the moment, property managers are their clients are the freeholders, and they do the freeholders' bidding. If they don't sweat an asset, then they'll be replaced. That's the reality of the situation. This is, I think, it's a secondary issue. Control of the service charges by the residents is far more important.
Thank you. Yeah. Very short answer to your question is yes. But I'd like to step back for a few moments and comment on some of the evidence you've had previously on the structure of the market. You have been told repeatedly that leaseholders control most of the sites that are out there. So I asked the building safety regulator, and he's provided me with the data of how the market is actually working, because all high-rise buildings have to be registered with him. His data says 4.5% of high-rise buildings are RTM controlled, and that 14.8% are RMC controlled. So less than 20% of the market is actually controlled by the people who pay the bills. And that puts a very different picture on why it is that we have to have more powers in there to support and help the consumer. The other statistic that I'd like to give you is, and I'll provide some more detailed data, in terms of the requests for help that come to the Leasehold Advisory Service, service charges is by far and away the largest item. However, 10% of the inquiries that come to us are on Section 20 consultation specifically. Now, Section 20 is a very important piece of legislation for major works. It's not worked properly since a Supreme Court case in 2013. The Competition and Market Authorities asked the Housing Department to review Section 20 in 2014. It still does not work. And it's perhaps one of the most important things that might be considered for adding to the bill.
Thank you.
There is one other thing. Right to manage could be made to work within this bill for estates, because people are being bullied out of their right to manage by freeholders writing letters to whole estates saying, you will get your premises, but we will still control the car parks and the gardens and the security. Recently, Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing Trust wrote to a block, 3 blocks which had just got right to manage, to tell them that all their leases were now going to have to be altered because they no longer were going to be contributing towards the communal areas. Brookside, for example, has sent out a threatening letter to all its leaseholders in a Cambridge estate saying that if they go for right to manage, they will have to pay the costs. This sort of bullying occurs because of the profit that is being taken away from the freeholders who are managing the estates. So if we can introduce just one thing, can we look at allowing again, when it first came in, right to manage did allow RTM for estates to include leasehold houses and freehold houses. Everything on an estate should be able to get right to manage as a whole estate, which will end the threats and the bullying and the misinformation.
Thank you. And Martin, I'm sure it will be appreciated for you to write to the committee with some of the further detail that you've referenced there.
I thank all the witnesses we've had today and their contributions. It will help formulate our views on this draft bill.